Good evening. Welcome to Social Media Talk. It's an honor for Bethel Church to host this talk tonight. My name is Jonas Bundy, and I'm one of the pastors here at Bethel Church. I'm thankful for this opportunity to learn with you and to participate alongside you in an experience that we've planned for the evening. Tonight's Social Media Talk is being broadcast on our social media. You'll find us on Facebook, YouTube, and also on our website at live.bethelfc.com. From wherever you are watching, whether here or online, welcome. Our schedule for the evening includes 3 talks from local subject matter experts, a short video highlighting the challenges of social media around the holidays, and then a panel discussion with our speakers. We will conclude by 8 p.m. As we visit about social media, we encourage you to share this event with your friends. What we will learn tonight will help all of us better engage in the online communities we're a part of. And throughout tonight's talk, if you have questions you would like to ask our panel of speakers, I want to encourage you to text those to 701-491-9420. You'll see that number throughout the night up on the screens. I would like to thank especially our event sponsor, the Dakota Medical Foundation, DMF. Since 1962, DMF has been connecting people and their life experiences to opportunities that improve the health and quality of life for people in our region. Today, DMF continues this mission by leading initiatives to create a region of the healthiest people, by building the fundraising success of charities, and by investing in new ideas that create widespread health and improvement. To our friends at DMF, thank you for sponsoring and promoting tonight's social media talk. We really appreciate you. Truly, DMF is helping us to be one of the most generous communities on the planet through Giving Hearts Day, the High Impact Institute, and Lend a Hand Up. If you can't tell, I am a big fan of what they're doing. I want to acknowledge tonight that we have a number of generations here in our audience. For some of you, you grew up with a telephone that was attached to a wall and invited you to move that little circle to dial a number. We welcome you. For others, you remember that same phone being attached to the wall, but at least your attachment cord was stretchy, and you could simply push those buttons to make a call. We welcome you. For many, you've seen those phones on TV, but the phone you use today is one where you simply tap the picture and place the call. We're glad you're here too. We're glad that all of us are here together tonight to learn. Over the last 20 years, we've had quite the learning curve with the explosion of opportunities to connect through social media. Some of you in the room will remember when LinkedIn began in 2002. And some of you will even remember that you have a profile somewhere on MySpace somewhere. For most of us, it's hard to imagine a time without Facebook, Google, and YouTube. Online networks, websites, and apps, well, they abound. Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram, Messenger, WeChat, TikTok, Twitter, Snapchat, Reddit, Pinterest, and more have become a daily part of many of our lives. How we navigate this myriad of opportunities to communicate online and to share information has presented a lot of challenges mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Tonight, we're going to hear from subject matter experts on how we can better navigate these rapid changes that more and more are a normal part of our lives. Again, that number, if you have questions to text, is 701-491-9420. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Stefanie Hanisch. Dr. Hanisch works at Sanford Health in Fargo, North Dakota. She is a board-certified adult, child, and adolescent psychiatrist. Dr. Hanisch has been working with young people struggling with symptoms of mental illness for almost 2 decades. She intentionally does not have a significant social media presence and sees the varying effects that social media can have on people of all ages on a daily basis. While visiting recently with Pat Traynor, the executive director of DMF, he went on and on about how helpful Dr. Hanisch has been to their efforts. He was especially grateful for her support in providing input for the Maddo Foundation, and those people are here tonight too, and we celebrate their work. Through her research and her medical practice, Dr. Hanisch knows well what our young people are experiencing, and it is my privilege to welcome Dr. Stefanie Hanisch. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's really a privilege to be here. It's quite a hot hot topic social media is right now, so I'm excited to do this. Again, my name is Dr. Stefanie Hanisch. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and as such, this presentation will be skewed just a little bit towards young people and children. So I hope that's okay with everybody. For many years in my house, homemade traditional German marble cake was the cake of choice for any special occasion. It was always requested by my kids for birthdays, my husband for anniversaries. And so some years ago, when my youngest was maybe 5 or 6, in the process of eating a slice of this cake, he just suddenly stopped and said, "Mom, is cake bad for you?" Well, and so as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, there's of course a million things going through my mind in that instant, but what I said pretty quickly was, "No, cake isn't bad for you." And I was fully prepared to expand upon that, but he had moved on and was on to the next subject, and I never got to say anything more about that. Well, later on in the evening, he proceeded to help himself to 2 more rather large slices of marble cake with a very innocent look on his face. Apparently, I had missed a really important opportunity to teach him about moderation, and that just because a little is good, more is not necessarily better. Could it be that it is similar with social media? I don't think that it's quite that simple. Again, as Jonas mentioned, I am intentionally not a huge user of social media, so that's something I'd like to say right off the bat. But as I was preparing for this presentation, I decided that I would be somewhat scientific, actually apply some scientific rigor and see what's out there research-wise, so that I could present what is available in a fashion that behooves the physician. Let me briefly start with what is social media, and this is just one of the many definitions that I found on the internet. A collective term for websites and applications that focus on communication, community-based input, interaction, content sharing, and collaboration. Well, sounds pretty good. You're probably all familiar with Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and then the ones that are much more popular with young people, things like Snapchat and TikTok. As I was doing research for this, it also turned out that the closer I looked and the deeper I did some research, the less clear things became. Or perhaps it was a matter of I just didn't like what I was seeing in the research. But what does the research say about social media and mental health? And I will briefly talk about these studies, not because they are exceptionally good or important, but just because I think they give a little bit of an idea of how complicated things are. In 2018, Jean Twenge published a research article that identified a correlation between time spent on electronic media, new media screen time, and a rise in depressive symptoms and suicide-related outcomes in adolescents between 2010 and between the times of 2010 and 2015. Sorry, there's a typo in there, and I thought I had corrected that, so it's catching me a little off guard. So this study actually got some headlines in the media, and it was kind of what everybody expected that there might be. There was no question that suicide and depression rates were going up at around the same time. A couple of years later, she brought out another study that delved a little bit more deeply into trying to see, is it all media and screen time, or is it something about social media that's worse than other things? And found that in fact, social media use and internet use compared to things like internet gaming was more correlated with adverse mental health effects. And that these effects were, in fact, much more strongly associated with bad outcomes in girls rather than in boys. The next study caught my interest because it's an 8-year longitudinal study. Those are rare and quite unusual. The author challenged the previous study, or at least questioned it, saying that unless we can prove that increasing or decreasing time spent on social media by individuals was correlated with worsening depression in the case of increase, or improving depressive symptoms with decreasing social media time, we really weren't showing anything of significance. Anyway, long story short, she found that there was no correlation between time spent on social media and adverse mental health effects. Go figure. The fifth study was a little different. They didn't focus on pathology as much as they did on psychological well-being. And they interviewed some university students, and the author talked about what he referred to as social capital, the concept that having connections, both a small group and a much larger group, was a good and supportive thing and was helpful to our psychological well-being. And finally, less of a quantitative and more of a qualitative study, meaning they didn't really measure anything, but it was a study out of the United Kingdom that interviewed a group of non-clinical, so adolescents who had not been identified as having any kind of mental illness, and groups of mental health practitioners about the benefits and the downfalls of social media. They identified some good, which was improved connections, some stress release and distraction from day-to-day stress. They recognized that it could interfere with sleep and decrease your time with interactions with significant others in your life in person, and also identified what they referred to as the ugly, which is a lot of the cyberbullying and some of the really bad things that inevitably can happen to people on social media. What was interesting to me in that study is that the adolescents and the mental health practitioners agreed that in general, social media probably had its risks and its downfalls, but that the adolescents in particular always referred to those dangers and risks as occurring and happening to other adolescents, not themselves. So somehow, perhaps more vulnerable or more impaired adolescents, and did not recognize or acknowledge that those same ill effects could affect them personally. All right, so what do you make of all of this? Well, first of all, it's complicated. Just because two things occur at the same time, meaning there is an increase in depression and suicide rates and an increase in time spent on social media, does not necessarily mean that the two are causally related. There is a hypothesis or a theory that says it's not really what we do on social media or how much time we spend, but what we aren't doing when we are doing those, when we're on social medias and in front of our devices, that could potentially have bad outcomes. And then another school of thought that says, well, maybe it is true that people who are already at risk, who are struggling more, are perhaps more likely to go to social media and to spend more time there. So, what do we really know? What we know is that social media is used by the majority of people in the US and across the world. Facebook has 2.7 billion users. Instagram, 1.2 billion. I think the numbers for TikTok are 700 million, Snapchat 500 million. A lot of people are on social media. Many, many people are struggling with mental illness. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in adolescents and young people. Let me say that again. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in adolescents and young people. That to me is a very, very disturbing statistic. The pandemic certainly has not helped. I think we would all acknowledge that it's been a hard time. We've all taken strain during the pandemic. Not all social media are created equal, and in particular, young girls seem to be particularly vulnerable to certain platforms. And that, I think, relates to a tendency to want to live up to some impossible norm of perfection, either in physical appearance or in just our lives. There's a lot of information and misinformation on social media, there's no doubt about that. My concern about some of that is that the suggested content that is offered to users of social media is very quickly can lead you down a dangerous path, be that if you're thinking about eating disorders or depression or even self-harm, but even with other views, you tend to see less and less of other people's thoughts and your own thoughts. It becomes more of an echo chamber. And we also do know that some studies indicate a positive effect and that many people report positive effects on mental health, again, especially during the pandemic, where travel and being close to loved one has been difficult. All right, so this is a quote that struck out to me, is that if repeated efforts to understand the psychological effects of entertainment technology teach us anything, it's that definite answers may always elude us. This psychologist, Dr. Ferguson, is known, or he has published on the effects of violent video games on the players. And it's not what you would think. So I'd like to change gears just a little bit, because some of that is not very satisfying and not necessarily always what I see in my practice. But I'd like to focus a little bit on what's important to promote mental health. Back to the basics. Sleep is one of the most important things, and I talk about that extensively in my practice. And so if being on devices and being on social media is getting in the way of sleep, then that is a problem. Relationships over there, intentionally bolded because they are so important for all of our well-being, and a good solid research to indicate that good social support networks, some of that might be social media, but mostly in person, are so beneficial for our health and our longevity even. Nutrition, eating healthily, and not too much cake, by the way, and staying active, both physically and mentally, are all things that are very, very helpful. I would be missing an opportunity here. The other thing that is important for mental health is preventing, identifying, and treating trauma. The research on trauma is unequivocal, and there is no doubt that the effects of early adverse childhood events are long-standing, both on mental health and on physical health. Trauma in childhood, but also trauma in adulthood. I'm not talking about broken bones and motor vehicle accidents, though those can certainly be traumatic, but abuse-related trauma. And if anybody's interested, I would encourage you to Google the ACEs study. It's Adverse Childhood Experiences. Good, solid data and a fascinating read. Things as basic as just staying in touch with nature, taking time to be out there, putting the phone down, and breathing, experiencing nature. Again, a growing body of evidence that that's helpful for all kinds of mental illness. Guidelines for using social media in positive ways. The pediatricians have long talked about the 5-2-1-0, and so I'm stealing from the pediatricians. There's a zero missing there. 5 servings of fruits and vegetables, not cake, a day is what they recommend. At least no more than 2 hours of any kind of screen time, and an hour of play and active engagement for kids, and the 0 would be no sugary drinks. Pretty basic, but we could all probably live healthier lives if we followed that very advice. Consider the opportunity cost. Thinking about our own lives and our children's lives, society, what are we missing as we are scrolling through the social media feeds? Is it interacting with a person who's sitting right next to you? Is it sleeping, which is detrimental to your mental health? Also, how does it make you feel? If it's a good, affirming, positive reaction that you're having, then by all means, keep doing it. But if you feel sad, angry, and somehow not enough or less than when you're going through social media and looking at other people's posts, then don't do that. No screens in the bedroom. This is one of the few things that I will quite consistently instruct parents in my practice to do. Is not only will the content and the engagement keep you up, the light that comes off the screen, regardless of the size of the screen, will actually send a message to the brain to say that, hey, it's time to be awake. Just in closing, real briefly, for parents, set a good example. The whole notion of do as I say works much better if that's also what you are doing. It is okay to set limits, no screens in the bedroom. Again, that was intentionally repeated. A couple of things that I just thought were worthwhile including is there's a movement called Wait Until 8th of a group that are encouraging parents to consider delaying giving kids access to smartphones until they're in 8th grade. Unfortunately, it hasn't gained as much traction as I would have liked it to, but it's certainly worth considering. And the other website, if you are ever concerned or questioning the appropriateness of an app or a video game or even a movie, Common Sense Media does a very nice job of giving parents advice about that. Finally, offer alternatives and be involved. If you are suddenly trying to cut down on your use of social media, you'll have to be intentional and mindful of offering other things, being creative, being outside, getting involved in other activities. It's quite difficult to say to a child who has been on their devices for hours to say, okay, now we're taking the phone away, we're turning it off, but there's nothing there to fill the void. And getting some of that creativity back will take time. Finally, be curious, extend yourselves grace, extend others grace, try and understand what's driving behaviors as it relates to social media. And try not to judge others or yourselves. It is easy to be hard on yourself when you think you should be better on things, be that screen time or diet or exercise. Again, extend yourself some grace. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you who have sent in questions already. Please keep those coming. Again, we'll have a panel discussion here at the end, and that number is 701-491-9420. Our next speakers are Stephen and Sarah Dunkel. Stephen and Sarah met and graduated from Wheaton College with master's degrees in historical theology, biblical exegesis, and intercultural studies. Together, they lead student ministries at Bethel Church for students in 7th through 12th grades. Along with a small army of committed adults, they help disciple more than 100 teenagers each week. They have spoken at several conferences on topics including Gen Z and digital resources for disciple making. And together, they helped create the Speak Truth app. This is a free resource for disciple making conversations available in the App Store and on the Google Play Store. The Dunkels are a gifted couple with a heart to serve the youth of our generation. And they're quick to say that our students aren't just the church of tomorrow, they're the church of today. I love that. With the weekly pulse on what our teenagers are experiencing, it will be great to hear from Stephen and Sarah. It's my privilege to welcome Stephen and Sarah Dunkel.
50 years ago, families passed around the same newspaper. They watched the same shows from a shared television screen. They had different preferences, but they had shared media experiences.
Today, family members enter the digital world alone on separate devices. They read completely different and often contradictory news sources. They consume digital content and culture separately. So when they sit around the dinner table and try to talk about their digital experiences, they don't know where to start.
Meet the Generations, our fictional family for this evening. While not everyone fits the stereotypes, they provide a starting point for our conversation. We'll start with Boomer Dad in the pink polo.
Then there's Gen X Mom in the purple.
Gen Y Son is on the right.
And Gen Z Daughter on the left. Now, each of their lives has been dramatically impacted by social media, but in vastly different ways.
Imagine the scene. It's Gen X Mom's birthday, and Boomer Dad's taking the whole family out for dinner. Gen X Mom spends the early evening responding to birthday wishes on Facebook, while Gen Z Daughter binges TikTok in her bedroom. Boomer Dad calls Millennial Son at work to tell him the time and place. They meet at the restaurant, place their orders, and make some small talk. How's school? Fine. Work? Same as always. Someone takes out their phone. Then another. Sound familiar? By the time the food arrives, everyone's in their own digital world.
When did our social media use drift from connecting us to disconnecting us? From being a time saver to a time waster? From being a social experience to an antisocial escape? And more importantly, how can we retake control of our digital lives? Over the next 18 minutes, we'll explore the impact of social media on relational health. Relational health is the quality of relationships in our lives. We'll tell the story of 4 generations' journeys with social media, share a tech tip for each generation, and leave you with a practical challenge that applies to all generations. And it all starts with boomers.
Dad belongs to the baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, now ages 57 to 75. Named after the post-World War II baby boom, they possess over half of the nation's wealth. Boomer Dad is more likely to call than text, still prefers paper to digital, and asks his kids for help when downloading an app. Still, Boomer Dad is on social media. His platforms of choice are Facebook, to connect with friends and family, YouTube, to watch entertaining videos, and LinkedIn, to connect professionally. And Boomer Dad isn't an anomaly. According to Forbes, 84% of boomers say social media improves their lives. Boomer Dad grew up around professional journalism, so he trusts and shares what he reads. One Princeton study found that boomers share nearly 7 times as much fake news as younger generations. But at least Boomer Dad joins the conversation. What tech tip can we learn from boomers? Join the conversation. Studies repeatedly show that active social media use, actions like posting, commenting, sharing, and liking, has a much more positive effect on our health than passive use, simply scrolling or mindlessly clicking on suggested content. That takes us to Gen X.
Mom belongs to Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980, now ages 41 to 56. Sometimes called the lost or latchkey generation, Gen X is the smallest of the generations, known for their hard work and independence. Gen X Mom didn't grow up with social media, but she has fully embraced it. She texts, uses emojis, and comments regularly. Like Boomer Dad, her main choices are Facebook and YouTube, preferring to stick to the platforms she knows. Gen X Mom fears that social media may be moving too quickly for her to keep up with, but that doesn't stop her from trying. She may have had a low-tech childhood, but she found herself in the world of high-tech parenting. And sometimes her kids have to play translator, like this image demonstrates. Now, you may be surprised to learn that your Facebook feed isn't a random sampling of your friends' content. It's a data-driven algorithm designed to keep you scrolling for as long as possible. Studies show that fake news, clickbait, and bad news hold our attention for much longer than good news. When Gen X mom stops to like and comment on her friend's perfect little life, she trains the algorithm to show more posts like this, and she increasingly feels like she can't measure up. When she reads the comments on a polarizing news article, she trains the algorithm to prioritize these types of political views. She starts to see only certain types of news, creating information gaps and fueling further polarization. What tech tip can we learn from Gen X? Train your feed. Your feed has tools to control the content that you see. If certain people have a negative effect on you, you can unfriend or unfollow them. If certain posts cause you stress, you can hide them. On Facebook and Twitter and Reddit, you can set your feed to show posts chronologically instead of by relevancy. Your feed shouldn't just subtract time from your life. It should add value. And that takes us to Millennials.
Sun belongs to Generation Y, a.k.a. Millennials, born between 1980 and 1996, now ages 25 through 40. Yes, Millennials are now in their 40s. We were the first generation who grew up with the internet and are dubbed digital natives. We are the largest generation in the workforce, and we don't just want to make dollars. We want to make a difference. Millennial Son is constantly on social media. For work, he uses Slack, Teams, and Zoom. For play, YouTube and Facebook still reign supreme, but close behind are Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and Twitter. Because everything is on his phone, he struggles to find work-life balance. Millennials posted their adolescent lives on the internet, which remains searchable by friends and employers. We learned the hard way. What goes on the internet stays on the internet. Remember how Boomer Dad would rather call than text? Millennial Son is the opposite. A phone call is synchronous communication. You must respond now. A text or email is asynchronous communication. You can respond at your convenience. While Boomer Dad thinks a phone call is more personal, Millennial Son thinks it's more disruptive, hence the culture clash. Millennials check social media more times throughout the day than previous generations, and some even check it throughout the night. More than 70% of millennials sleep with their phones within reach. Half automatically pick it up if they're awakened throughout the night, leading to poor sleep quality and excessive sleepiness during the day. The result of all this? 1 in 3 millennials say social media worsens their lives. What tech tip can we learn from millennials? Build digital boundaries. In his book, The Happiness Advantage, Sean Achor explains the 20-second rule. Achor wanted to play more guitar and watch less TV, but his guitar was in the closet, and getting to it took that extra 20 seconds, so he never did. What did he change? He put his guitar in the living room, and he kept his TV remote batteries in the closet, 20 seconds away. Guess what happened? He started playing more guitar and watching less TV. How can the 20-second rule apply to social media boundaries? Log out of your account. Give yourself a long password to log back in. Take social media apps off the front page of your phone. Turn off notifications so they don't distract you. And buy an alarm clock. Don't sleep next to your phone.
For me personally, I set a 30-minute limit on my phone's Facebook app, which kicks me out until the next day.
For me, I log out after each use, and I have to manually type in my password to log back in.
We both have social media notifications turned off on our phones, and we charge them in the kitchen at night.
That takes us to
Gen Z. Daughter belongs to Generation Z. Born in 1997 and later, the oldest of whom are now age 24. Called the digital generation and screenagers, they never knew a world without social media. Gen Z daughter is as comfortable in her digital world as she is in her physical one. Like her brother, she is on multiple social media platforms, but her top ones are different. She's definitely not using Facebook. That's her parents' platform. Instead, she prefers Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, and TikTok. Gen Z uses social media primarily for entertainment. They're just as likely to follow influencers, brands, and celebrities as they are family and friends. Gen Z daughter is more private online than her brother. She's learned the dangers of oversharing. She prefers short-term social media, like Snapchat, where the messages disappear, or Instagram stories, only available for 24 hours. She also has multiple accounts. Normal Instagram, work Instagram, and even fake Instagram, known as a Finsta. This allows her to separate her public persona from her authentic self, which only a few select friends get to see. Now, one of the main differences between in-person and online communication is the lack of physical body language, things like facial expressions or hand gestures. How do digital natives make up for this lack of information? They use digital body language, things like emojis or non-standard punctuation. Humans send 10 billion emojis every day. Millennials may have started the trend, but Gen Z has refined it. Let's look at some examples. Millennial son might use the laughing, crying face to convey laughter. Gen Z uses the skull, short for I'm dead, meaning dying of laughter. Gen X mom might use the heart emoji to say that she loves her friend's post. Gen Z uses the fire emoji because it's lit. To older generations, this emoji is a friendly smile. To Gen Z, it's an awkward face, like faking a smile. Really changes the meaning, doesn't it? Another part of digital body language is punctuation. Look through your texts with a Gen Zer and you'll notice one thing they share in common: a lack of periods at the end of messages. To older generations, punctuation is a part of correct grammar. To younger generations, punctuation indicates tone. Exclamations are warm. Unpunctuated is neutral. Periods are cold. True story. Our millennial friend was texting her Gen Z brother, and she put a period at the end of the text. He later found her and asked, "Why are you mad?" Now, does this mean that we all need to start messaging like Gen Z? No, but it can sure be helpful to realize that our digital body languages may differ. 96% of Gen Z owns a smartphone, and more than half spend 10+ hours a day on their devices. But like millennials, they've learned that more isn't always better. 59% of teens have experienced online harassment. And if you followed the news recently, you may have heard of the Facebook files, where a whistleblower from Facebook leaked a study of how Instagram negatively affects self-image in teen girls. So what is Gen Z doing about all this? One study by Origin found that 64% of Gen Z takes breaks from social media, more than any other generation. So what tech tip can we learn from Gen Z? Take digital breaks. Examples include ditching your phone after 9 p.m., taking a digital Sabbath on Saturdays, or leaving your phone at home when you go to school. Some studies show that as many as 89% of people have experienced phantom phone vibration syndrome, where we think our phone is going off, but we just imagined it. Anyone? We need zones and times that are phone-free. Remember earlier this month when Facebook and Instagram were down for a couple of hours? It's like that, but intentional. Join the conversation. Train your feed. Build digital boundaries and take digital breaks.
Let's head back to the dinner table. The food arrives, everyone pockets their phones and picks up their silverware. Boomer Dad breaks the silence. I was just messaging my brother. He wishes you a happy birthday.
Gen X Mom adds, I just found out on Facebook that your cousin and her husband are expecting a baby. How exciting.
Millennial Son jumps in. I just responded to a few work messages. This new project's really going to help a lot of people.
Gen Z Daughter replies, I just watched this hilarious video and I forwarded it to the group chat.
Each of these topics sparks its own conversation. They talk for an hour straight around the dinner table, but it feels like 5 minutes. And social media sparked it all. Intergenerational relationships are essential to relational health. Social media has separated the generations like never before, but it also provides tools to bring us back together. Here's our tech challenge for all generations. Invite others into your digital world.
How can Gen Z Daughter explain the newest TikTok trend to her Gen X mom, who's never seen a TikTok?
How can Boomer Dad hear Millennial Son's thoughts on an interesting article if he never shares it?
This week, have a conversation with someone from a different generation on social media. You'll be surprised at how much you learn from each other.
Relational health starts with connection, a meaningful interaction with another person. Every time we comment on a friend's post, message a family member, or have a face-to-face conversation, we form a connection.
Multiple connections form a relationship. Every connection has the opportunity to improve the quality of that relationship, both online and in person.
Multiple relationships form a community. Every relationship comes together around a shared interest. Social media has made shared interests searchable, connecting us to like-hearted people we might never have met in person.
And multiple communities form a culture. The shared interests of the community evolve into a shared mission, which is passed down from generation to generation. But this can only happen if the generations stay connected to one another.
It's no longer 1971. We may not have a shared newspaper. We may not watch the same channels, but we still have a shared humanity. If we take an interest in each other's interests, if we invite each other into our digital lives, we can make social media a truly social place again, as one of many tools to build meaningful connections, relationships, communities, and culture.
Join the conversation. Train your feed. Build digital boundaries, take digital breaks, and invite others into your digital world. Thank you.
Thank you.
I missed that fist bump on the intro. We had to make sure we got that right. I love those guys. Hey, if you have a question for them or one of our other speakers, please continue to text those in. I'm enjoying seeing those come through and documenting those. Looking forward to our panel. Again, that number is up on the screen, 701-491-9420. Our third and final speaker tonight is Seth Dunham. Seth currently serves as a senior pastor of Salem Evangelical Free Church in Moorhead, Minnesota. Seth is married to Nikki, and together they have one daughter named Eden. She's 3, and they're currently in a second round of adopting and looking forward to that. Seth earned his Master of Divinity with an emphasis in counseling and pastoral care from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And before becoming a senior pastor, Seth worked in student ministry for 15 years. He loves coffee, the outdoors, and most sports. Notably, he drives a Jeep, and he's a diehard Chicago Cubs fan. If asked, he might even tell you about how the Cubs won a World Series 5 years ago. You'll notice right away that Seth values authentic relationships. What you see is what you get with Seth. Through his unique and relatable teaching, we'll hear from Seth how we can further cultivate meaningful relationships where we are fully known and loved. It is my privilege to welcome Pastor Seth Dunham.
Thanks, Jonas. How many of you guys feel like you're learning something tonight? I felt like I just learned so much about myself. That was crazy, things I've never even known. That's so bizarre. So thanks, Steve and Sarah. Like Jonas said, my name is Seth, and it's my task tonight to talk about the impact of social media on our spiritual health. And I feel like there's a bazillion different things that we could cover tonight. There's like so many different angles that we could come at from this. Like we could talk about how we steward our time. Right, that's a big thing. Like, how many of you guys have ever gotten a notification on your phone that said, hey, congratulations, Seth, your screen time went down 31% last week. And I'm like, woohoo, good for me. And then it says you're still on 35 hours, like it's just crazy. So we could talk about stewardship. We could talk about the comparison trap. We could talk about like how we're climbing these ladders, these never-ending ladders, and how we envy up and how we scorn down. We could talk about moral authority, right? We live in a world with social media, like with anybody with a Twitter account, all of a sudden becomes your authority, right? LeBron James can be your moral authority. Katy Perry can be your moral authority, right? Anybody with a Twitter account can do that. So I feel like there's so many different angles that we could talk about. But the reality is, for me tonight, I want to focus on one thing, one word, and that's the word story. Because I think that social media is really a platform for ultimately what? It's for sharing stories. And stories are powerful because they woo us into new and exciting possibilities about ourselves. So if you have ever been around me for long enough, you'll probably hear me say, I love this phrase, it's the phrase, learn to follow your rabbi so closely that the dirt from his sandals clings to your garments. And the reason why I love that is because when I see that, it creates this image in my mind of me walking along the dusty paths, the roads in Galilee alongside Jesus. And I want to be so close to Jesus. There's not a single word or action that I want to miss. I want to be so close that as he's walking and his sandal lifts off the ground and he stirs dust up into the air, that I would be right there, that it would cling to me. You see, it's powerful. And stories are powerful because words are intrinsically powerful. Like we go all the way back to creation, right? Like how does the cosmos come into being, right? Is it like God, like all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's a star, there's Earth. No, like he spoke it into being with the word. He brings it into being. And it's not just of God, it's also of mankind. Right? In Proverbs, he says, the author says that it's in the tongue that we have the power to bring life or to bring death. And so the reality is that stories are powerful because they're always either moving us towards life or they're moving us towards death, right? Stories are intrinsically and incredibly powerful, but there's one story that's more powerful than every other story combined, and that's God's story, right? So This is a tool that I like to use because for many of us, we're visual learners. So hopefully I can put this together for you in a way that is simple and clear. Because when we talk about God's story, right, who do we start with? We start with this character, this being who's God. And he's represented by God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And he mind-bafflingly lives forever. That's who he is. He's incredible, holy and perfect and infinite in nature. But enter in us into the story. How does God bring us into being, right? He begins with creation, right? And you've got Adam, and you've got Eve, and they're happy. They're happy because everything in life is the way that it's supposed to be, right? There's peace, there's no fear, there's no insecurity, there's nothing. In fact, the only thing that they're not supposed to do, the only rule is don't eat of this fruit, right? So spoiler alert, if you haven't read the Bible, right? What happens is that they eat the fruit, and in so doing, they actually usher death into the world, right? So you've got Adam, you've got Eve, and they're like sad, right? Like they don't even want to look at each other because like this is the brokenness that happens in life, right? And the reality is that for each of us, for Adam and Eve, what happens in this moment is that sin, as it enters in, as there's guilt and shame and fear and insecurity that enters into our life, the thing that we do most naturally is not to stay in the public, but instead, if I could, I would go back behind this curtain, but I can't, right? So I would come back into the shadows, and this is a space where I hide and I cover, right? Because that's where I'm safe and that's what's comfortable, right? And this is the fallenness of humanity. And if this were the only piece of the story, it'd be very bleak. It'd be a very, very bad story to tell your kids as they go to bed, right? But that's not where the story ends, right? The story continues. And Jesus enters in, and by his death, and what he does is that he bears on his body the total train wreck that is humanity, right? And he takes on all of their sins, and he offers the forgiveness of sins as a gift to humanity, right? And all it needs to do is to be received. And so Jesus takes all of this death and all of this brokenness, and he enters into this relationship, and it's like he looks at me and says, Seth, here's what I want you to know. Here's what I want you to know. I know every single thing that there is to know about you. I know what you tell other people and what you want people to think, but I know the real you. But guess what? This is the beauty of the gospel, is he says, I understand, no stone unturned, and I love you fully, completely, and 100%. Right? That's amazing, right? But the story doesn't even end there, right? The story continues with this idea of consummation, and it goes all the way to the end when the shalom, or the peace of God, is finally ushered in to the story, and what was fully broken here will be fully restored for the rest of time and for the rest of humanity. And so it's our nature for each of us, though, ever since the fall, ever since right here, right? There's this reality because there's a gap between the presentation that I want people to think of me and the me that I know that I really am. And I know that we know this. We all think about this from time to time, but we shut it off pretty quickly because we don't really want to discover what's behind. And we have this front stage, this public sphere, and this backstage, this private sphere. And what we long, this is so true, is at the core of our heart, at the end of every single day, what every single human being wants is for someone to enter in and to say, I understand completely all of your mess and all of your brokenness, and I fully know you and I fully love you. That's the basic human desire at the end of every single day, right? And the only way to reconcile this gap between who I want the world to think that I am and the me that I know I am, the only way to reconcile that gap is in the person and the works of Jesus. And that's the gospel story. Right? But here's the tension. Here's the tension for us as people, right? We live in between these two things, right? Here's us. We live in between this, right? What has started already in Jesus is not yet fully completed. So even though we have this massive, incredible, amazing, like God-giving gift of story to us, that's the most powerful story, right, in the whole universe, we are still susceptible to other stories. We're still susceptible to other stories. Dallas Willard is an author, and one of the things that he wrote is that we are immersed in birth to death, wall-to-wall noise, some silent and some not silent. You see, from the moment that I'm born to the moment that I die, I am in this hallway of noise, in this hallway of information, right? And so for me, I have to be very careful. Oops, I didn't realize I had to do that. There we go. I have to be very careful about what I am allowing into my heart. What's this inflow? What's coming into my heart? What's coming into my soul? There's a study that was done in 2010, and so it may be updated since then. But in 2010, they said, this is crazy, that in 2 days' time, we as a world, as a massive community, produce as much information as they did from the dawn of civilization to the year 2003. In 2 days, that's how much information we produce. And as a part of that information that's in the world, right, is social media. In fact, 95 million photos are posted to Instagram on a daily basis. 95 million photos. And my first instinct, or maybe our first instinct, when we wake up in the morning, is to grab that phone right from the side of me, because I just learned from Stephen and Sarah that it doesn't really move far away from me, right? I grab it and I begin to scroll and post and scroll. And what I'm doing is that I'm inviting the power of story into my life. And so I want you to think about the content of those stories for a moment. So here's a picture of my wife and daughter. And you look at this picture, and I look at this picture and I go, wow, my life is awesome. My life is great. Like, I have the best wife, the best daughter. Like, we must be incredibly godly parents because there's no arguing, right? The house is clean. Everything is absolutely incredible. But when you zoom out, what you find is this massive mess, right? There's these books and toys strewn all over the floor. There's a week's worth of unfolded laundry at the end of the couch. There's a can of refried beans in the background. Like, it's just messy. Right? It's just messy, right? And so here's the reality. I think that when we are looking at photos, we oftentimes think that we're getting the whole picture, when in reality, we're getting a pixel. There are 96 pixels in a square inch. Maybe as a poor resolution photo, I don't really know. But let's assume that you have a picture that has 1,000 pixels in it. And if you remove 1 pixel from that picture, that leaves 999 pixels unknown. And when I project that pixel into the world, what I can be doing is present this narrow, distorted reality of what my life is actually really like. And so I think we have to stop and think about what we're actually exposing our hearts to when we look at some of these photos. Because my life, my posture is always, this is the disposition of the human heart, my posture is always going to want to bend to that reality. My posture is always going to want to bend to that reality. Guys, the problem is not that we see those pictures or that we see those stories. The problem is that we are far too quick to believe those stories. And the more stories we see, the more powerful they become, and the more we want to believe, right? It becomes this what-if scenario, right? If I'm looking at a pixel, I go, man, like their life is so great. Their story must be better than my story, so I'm going to pursue that story, right? It goes all the way back to the garden with the apple, right? When Satan enters into the story, he's like, guess what? Everything is perfect in life, and Satan, all he has to do is, guess what? Life would be better if you ate the fruit. They're like, cool, I'm in, right? It's this what if reality, right? And so the more that we see, the more we want to believe. And so it's not just about content. I want you to begin to think about the sheer volume of stories that we're inviting into our lives. Did you know that in 15 minutes of scrolling on your phone, 15 minutes, you consume as much information as your great-grandparents did in an entire month? This is a whole new world that we live in. Like Aladdin is singing. It's a whole new world, right? This is what we live in, right? And we live in a culture that says follow your heart, right? No, don't do that. That's such a bad idea, right? Follow your heart. The Bible says that your heart is deceitfully wicked above all things, right? All things. Right? So don't follow your heart, right? Because bad things will happen if that's what you're going to do, right? And so it takes one lie for us. It takes one lie. If I think about this, if I come back to this picture, right? It takes one lie to throw me off of this entire story. One lie. Right? And if I look at this, all I have to go back to is look at this fruit, right? This is when life was perfect, and Satan enters in, and all it took was a simple little lie, and it derails the perfection of God's story. And this one story has power to do that in my life if I allow it to. And if it's not just one story, though, when I think about the sheer content and volume, it's not just one story, it's actually 95 million stories that I'm bringing power into my life. And I have to be careful with what I'm bringing in to my life. But it's not just about what I bring in, right? Because what comes in also goes out. Right? And so it's also about what I overflow into this world, right? It's also about what I'm giving other people, not just what I'm taking in. Because what's going to happen is that we're going to end up reciprocating, and we can push these things back out. It's a good principle. It's a good principle that we multiply that which we're given, because you and I are designed in the image of God. We're designed to imitate. And so if this is what's coming in, guess what's probably going to be going out, right? Guess what's probably going to be going out. And what we end up doing is that we zoom in so close in our picture that we leave out the mess and we leave out the brokenness. And what we don't see is that what we're doing in this moment is we're actually removing the gospel from the story, because the gospel isn't needed when everything is good. The gospel is for our brokenness and for our mess. And so we don't need the gospel when we do that. And what ends up happening is that we think that we are innocently, we can. I'm not saying we always do this, please be clear. Right? Sometimes what we do is we post stories out there, and what we're doing is we think that we're telling a story when in reality we're actually selling a story. Because we want people with all of our heart to buy into this is who I really am, and this is how good my life actually is. And guys and gals, how we present ourselves to the world, I think, really matters. The Apostle Paul wrote this in Colossians 3, 9 through 10. He says, "Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator." Right? This is powerful. See, what the author is doing in this moment is that he knows that when we are a new creation, the old has gone and the new has come. And so we've been given this fixed and permanent identity, and yet we still oftentimes choose to live in the old identity. And what the author is saying is that when you do that, you're lying. Because you're presenting a picture to the world that has nothing to do with the transformation of what Christ has done in your life. It's actually a lie. And what we can do is we can end up giving a very confusing message to the world that we live in, right? And this picture always comes to my mind when I think about this, right? Joey enters into the room from Friends, and he's wearing every piece of possible clothing that he can. And underneath that, and somewhere, is the original. It's what God says, this is my permanent identity for you. This is the new creation. And yet so oftentimes we use social media just to play out this scenario where I post, and I give all these new realities of who I am. You guys, here's the deal. The problem isn't that other people see my story, whatever it is I'm posting, because we're talking about overflow, what's coming out of me. The problem isn't what other people see. If they see my story, the problem is that they're going to be just as quick to believe my story as I was of theirs. If the gospel's not a part of it, right? If the gospel's not a part of it. This is a great quote from Madonna. Here's what she says. She says, "My drive in life comes from a fear of being mediocre that is always pushing me. I push past one spell of it and discover myself as a special human being, but then I feel I am still mediocre and uninteresting unless I do something else. Because even though I have become somebody, I still have to prove that I am somebody. My struggle has never ended, and I guess it never will." Because if Madonna, who is rich and famous and powerful and beautiful, struggles with validation, what chance do we have to reconcile that gap? You see, spiritual health is built on inflow and overflow in our lives, what I put in and what comes out, right? And the danger of social media is that I can be posting or selling a story or telling a story or believing partial truths about people's lives. And guys, here's what I would say is that the primary story that needs to be coming into our life is in fact this story. The gospel story, God's story. That needs to be the primary, most powerful story in our life. And that's what needs to be coming in. And therefore, what needs to be coming out, what's overflowing out of me is now the most powerful story. It's not now my story, it's God's gospel story. What comes in then goes out. And so I'll end with this. So now what? What's the way to wrap this up? Here's what I would say. God's story is the single most powerful story in the universe. In fact, it's so much more powerful. We look at this and we are overwhelmed by the amount of things that are coming into our life. We go, wow, that's a ton. 95 million? I know that I'm not actually exposed to that much, but maybe I am over the course of weeks or months. And that's an overwhelming thing. And God's story is so much more powerful than that story, than all of those stories combined. It's incredible, it's extravagant, it's amazing. But here's what I would also say is that your story is the most powerful tool that you have. So what if social media became a platform where we use our story to tell God's story? You notice how the shifting and the balance would change, right? Because the platform for communication is changing in this world, and we have the opportunity, right, to give the world something that they're not getting anywhere else. And so here's my thought, just one thing. Don't give up on social media. Don't give up on it, right? Use it in the way that it can be used, but for a platform for God's story. But lastly, I would say, and more importantly maybe, is don't give up on relationships, real relationships. Invest in it deeply and begin to ask great questions and deep questions that help people see the difference between this gap and allow them to be reconciled where this gap comes together in the person and in the works of Jesus Christ. And so my prayer for us tonight then as we leave, as we wrap up, well actually before we do this would be this. My prayer is that for each of us that we would learn and want to follow Jesus so closely that the dirt from his sandals clings to our garments. Thanks.
Let's get together in harmony. Let's get together like family.
Hey, son, I'd like to show you how I prepare a ham.
Hey, Dad, I'm actually watching a video on how to prepare a ham right here. So thank you so much.
Boys, no devices at the table.
It starts with her.
It starts with her.
It starts with him.
It starts with him.
And then at us. And then at them.
But I do know this. I'm thankful for you guys. What do you say we go ahead and carve this turkey?
Oh my gosh, Luke Johnson's on live. His dad's cutting the turkey. I just love his family.
Hey guys, it's been a great Thanksgiving. Let's just get a look at all the cousins hanging out, having fun. Guys, seriously, can we put the devices down?
Okay, everyone get together for the photo. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, got it.
Hey, send that one to me.
Send that to me.
Would you like to go get some chocolate pie with me?
I would love to.
Let's get together, oh, what a sight, what a sight, what a sight, what a sight.
I think they borrowed their material from you guys on the generations there. Hey, this is wonderful. I brought a red pen so I can see my notes. It's full, and I appreciate what each of you have shared tonight. Just a real quick review. I've got a few texts that have come in about this 5210. Could you go back over that really quick?
Sure. It's borrowed from the pediatricians. It's 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, no more than 2 hours of screen time a day, 1 hour of physical activity or physical play, and no sugary drinks. That's the formula.
Okay. Well, related to that, and this is interesting, you know this as a parent, over the last 2 years, school has changed a lot. And this whole 2-hour limit thing gets contested. And so there's this new challenge for a lot of us as parents, especially parents of kids. Now all their schoolwork is on the screen. How should we think about screen time and kids doing schools and then this additional screen time? Do you have any advice from your world, Dr. Hanisch?
That's a really good point. And of course, that skews everything. And we cannot simply... we cannot count those educational hours as screen time. The intention here is screen time that is for entertainment, so TV, gaming for a lot of kids. But it does add up, doesn't it? Suddenly we are talking 4, 5, 6, 7 hours of screen time. I, for one, am certainly glad that kids are back in school where they need to be. The online schooling was difficult for a lot of kids, especially some of my patients. But kids in general, I think, do better when they are in the same space with other kids.
Sure. Well, thank you for acknowledging that with us, that is a challenge. And I think, to your point earlier about be curious and be gracious to yourself, that is a place where we're going to have to extend ourselves some grace because the world just changed in the last 2 years related to these things. Sarah, this one was for you. A person who identifies as a Gen Xer wants to know, how can they set a timer on Facebook?
I would say ask your son or daughter, and they will be able to help you. But if you go into the settings on your phone, you can control if you want to set a time limit on your certain apps or things like that. But yeah, either Google it or ask a younger person to help you.
I love it that we've got some generational talk going here. And Seth, I fear for our generation, there may have been some young people who don't know who Madonna is. But
Who what?
Madonna.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'm a little concerned about that. You spoke about this inflow, outflow, overflow. How have you seen and I think it's a little bit of a pivot, but the fear of missing out seems to be a big reality for a lot of us when we think about these realities in social media. How have you addressed that in your life or in your teaching?
Yeah, I mean, I was in student ministry for a long time, so I certainly know that that's a real thing. You know, the culture of being in and then jumping out is a weird reality, I think, as a person from my generation to wrestle with. But I think that, one of the things that I found in the midst of that is developing key, core, intentional, really deep relationships, because that's what students want. That's what younger kids want. They want someone who really knows them and who's inviting them, making those things worthwhile. It's less about the event or whatever it is that you're doing. It's more about the people that they get to be with. And so if you've spent the time on the front end investing in those people and that younger generation, right, like they're going to want to be with you, right? I had a mentor who used to say of his kids, who's a senior pastor, and he would say that I want my kids to love being with their family, and I want them to love being at the church. And I think if you invest the time that's necessary, and build those relationships, you can at least create a desire, that maybe combats some of the FOMO culture.
Thank you. Maybe for each of you or somebody raise your hand if you'd like to address this. We've looked at the what of social media. We've adequately, defined some of it. Why do you think we're so drawn to it? I mean, even now I pick up my phone to look at these texts that are coming in, and I'm being tempted by notifications that I haven't turned off that things are happening on my social media feed. Why is there such a draw there?
I'll take a first stab on that. I think to some extent we're hardwired as human beings to just want to know, to learn new things all the time. If there's something out there that we're not aware of, on some level it's a biological survival mechanism. If there's a lion behind the tree, I should know about that so that I can get ready. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that, but I think on some level it's a biological, hardwired, what's new, what's important, I need to know about this. So something we have to be intentional about counteracting.
To some extent, we have to acknowledge, too, these social media platforms are free, but they're also for profit. They want to engage us as long as possible for the purpose of collecting data and for the purpose of selling advertisement. And so everything of the social media experience is designed to addict us, to keep us wanting that next hit of dopamine, that next scroll, that next post, that next auto-played video, that next suggested content, and keep us going deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole to take more and more of our time to monetize the product, which if we're not paying for the product is us.
Yeah, and I think that there we go. I read this last week too, and I had heard it before, but it just reminded and brought things to me that when a product is free, you're probably the product. And so the same thing is true about video games as well. Like there's so many free platforms for games now, right? But kids are just addicted to some of those things because of the rhythms that go into that. So I think it's really significant to help people understand that we actually end up being the ones manipulated sometimes in those environments.
Yeah. Sarah, you had mentioned something about training the feed. What have you found helpful that way?
Yeah. I think for some people who maybe you just don't realize that you can train your feed, that it's something that you have control over, the content that is just popping up, whether that's your Facebook feed, Instagram, Twitter, Reddit, whatever platforms you're on. But yeah, just being really conscious about, Seth talking about inflow, where are you finding your inflow? What kind of inflow are you finding off of social media? And really checking to make sure that that's something that you want to be fed with. Checking how is it affecting you? What mental effect, emotional effect does it have on you? And if you're not liking the fruit of that, doing something about it. Unfollowing, is a great way to hide posts from someone without unfriending them. You don't have to feel like you're being mean and deleting them off of your friends list. You can just unfollow the content that they're posting. Or by hiding certain types of content, you can slowly start to train the algorithm that you don't want to see that type of content, and then it'll stop showing it to you because it wants to show you things that will keep you on that social media feed for longer.
That's really helpful. Very practical. I appreciate that. One of the things I've heard several of you speak to is that particularly the research seems to suggest that for younger girls and women, there seems to be an increased corollary negative for social media, and Instagram has been outed in these papers, etc. How does that impact your advice to parents who are trying to help their kids navigate the world of Instagram, Snapchat, etc.?
For starters, with children, most social media platforms will say very clearly that all users must be 13 or older. And if you as a parent are letting your child violate those guidelines, or you yourself are signing them up, then we have to question if even the for-profit platform itself is saying this is unwise for children, then why would we go beyond that boundary ourselves?
Yeah, I have found, certainly in my practice, kids are amazingly resourceful when it comes to getting around whatever the platform says, but even what we as parents are aware of. So it's been difficult to say you have to set limits, put parental controls on, turn this off, do that off, because next time I see the family back, well, Johnny's come up with a way of circumventing something, and so they're really, really smart. So I think that doesn't absolve us from the responsibility as parents to at least make an attempt to see what our kids are up to, but also trying to encourage open discussion, to your point about what we do for young girls. Trying to make them aware of their vulnerability, of potentially being used by the platform. How it's not as if, as women, trying to live up to some ideal is new to social media. That's always been the case if you think about how perfect movie stars are, or fashion industry. It's just that it's so much more, and the quantity is different. But having conversations, especially with our daughters, but also with boys, anybody, about the negative effects, and encouraging them to be introspective and reflective about how this makes them feel. It's at least a place to start. It's just hard to have a good guideline or a good recommendation on how to protect, because that's what we want to do as parents. We want to protect our children from being hurt and having bad outcomes from these social media.
Do you have a certain age that you think, okay, this is probably Stephen, you mentioned 13, so maybe that's and wait till 8th grade. Is that a pretty consistent thing for you guys up here on the platform? You think, okay, if they're younger than that, we need to be really careful, or what are you seeing?
It depends. As always, it's complicated because not all 13-year-olds are the same, and it depends on what platform we're talking about. It depends on how much, what time they're spending on what media. But certainly, I think 13 is better than 8 or 9, if that answers your question, Annie.
That's
this
helpful.
Is semi-related, but I know at one point Instagram was trying to release an Instagram for kids to try to get around some of these things of saying we don't want kids younger than 13 being on the Instagram for Adults platform. That was met with quite a bit of backlash when they announced that, so I think they've put that on hold. But one of the ways that even these tech companies are saying, how do we address this and try to provide a platform that if kids are going to be on it anyway, maybe we can provide a better alternative than the normal platform. But it's definitely a hard question.
Yeah. How much time is too much? We've heard from the pediatricians, 2 hours of entertaining screen time. Does anybody else care to weigh in, or what do you think, Pastor Seth?
What was the question?
How much time is too much time?
How much time? Oh my gosh. I don't know. Yeah, I got a 3-year-old that we're wrestling with at home. Like, my 3-year-old knows how to operate the phone as good as I do. I don't even give it to her, So, we're trying to navigate that without even having kids at that age yet. So, I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer to that.
Okay.
I know one stat that I had read, it said that the average person spends about 2 hours a day on social media specifically, and it works out over the course of a lifetime to be 5 years, 4 months, roughly. So I think if you look at it in that lens, maybe it gives you a little bit more scope and scale of what a few hours a day actually adds up to over a lifetime.
I had seen a similar statistic, except mine said 6 years and 8 months or something of an average adult's life is spent on social media. That's terrifying.
I'd like to say the answer is 86 minutes, or fill in the blank, but the reality is that these platforms have very different effects on each of us. And for some, the real answer is that 5 minutes might be too much on a certain platform because every time we log in, it has a negative effect on our overall health. For others, it might be a big part of the way that they connect with the world, and a higher number is okay. So we have to be self-reflective, but also we have to be honest that for most of us, the answer is what we're doing is too much.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things that I think many of you spoke to was this idea of there is a cost to my attention being given to a device in what's happening around me. And often I'm not aware of that opportunity cost that I'm missing out on. And so I can see where that would play into this conversation, that many times I confess I'm missing out on what's right in front of me because I'm substituting it with something else. Briefly, Dr. Hanisch, could you speak again to your comments related to trauma? Someone had a question about, could you rehearse what you had said or help us understand like the realities of trauma and how these things play together?
And it's loosely related to social media, probably not. I'm somewhat passionate about the effects of psychological trauma on mental health, and so I couldn't help myself. I had to put it in there. There is more and more good evidence that especially early adverse events in children, and that could be anything from actual abuse to losing a parent at a young age to growing up in a home with alcoholic parents or domestic violence within the home, significantly increases that young person's chances of things as diverse as, of course, depression and anxiety, but also cancers and cardiovascular disease. Wow. And so more and more we are seeing adult physicians paying attention to this too, because they end up taking care of folks who have chronic medical conditions who have a history of trauma in earlier life. So again, as a society, trying to prevent any kind of abuse and trauma and identifying that early on and then referring to treatment, because fortunately there is good evidence-based treatment for a lot of that.
Well, I appreciate your enthusiasm for us in that. And friends, I want to encourage you, if you're not aware of the program, again, I'm a big fan of what they're doing at DMF, and I think you've played a part in this in the Stand to Protect effort to help increase awareness of these realities and get out in front of it to prevent it so we have less. Right. It's an upstream effort that's being made. Let's see, Seth, just real quickly, did you have permission to share that picture?
Which picture?
With your wife and kid, and you zoomed out from pixel to...
I thought you were asking me about the Joey, and I was going to say no.
Okay.
But wife and daughter, absolutely.
Okay, good. Yeah.
It was a pose, so... But
okay.
It's not unlike what we do, we pose for it, so...
Yeah. Well, I wanted people to experience that personal, what you see is what you get, so thanks for that.
It's like you've been in my living room, so...
It was almost like I was really there.
Yeah, we're best friends.
And you did say you posed it, almost like a highlight reel.
It did look like that,
yeah.
Yeah, Nikki did it all. It's all her.
That's amazing.
I know, she's great.
Highlight reels and echo chambers, social media.
Mm-hmm.
Well, friends, I'm just so grateful. Last question, and then just a real quick follow-up. Do you have any great social media success stories? Do you have a story where you've seen just social media really added value to someone's life, whether it be your own or someone else's?
I can just briefly share that I think from a professional perspective, I just recently went to a conference where a lot of the physicians, it was women in medicine, and a lot of the physicians there were researchers, and they really emphasized how helpful a professional presence on some social media could be to have your research get out there, to be seen, be cited more. So there can be some really good things that happen.
If you want to learn more about their work, you can go to dakmed.org. That's dacmed.org. And then as a host, we want you to know that we at Bethel Church want to be here for you. If you don't have a church home, we encourage you to find a community of faith to plug into and to serve alongside with, to be known and to experience this love. We're one of many churches in our community that want to do this in the name of Jesus. You can learn more about our church and at bethelfc.com, or stick around and talk to some of our staff. I know Seth would love to visit with you as well. And I want to thank my colleague, Lori Veith, she's down here in the front row, for her vision for this event and the many people that helped her bring this together. Thank you, Lori, for doing this. And I trust for all of you that you'll walk away with some practical insights or tools that will help, that you can act on, maybe even tonight. For the Gen X friend, if you were here in the audience, I volunteer Sarah to help you with that Facebook setting. We'll find the answer to that. I hope you've enjoyed our time together as much as I have. Thank you all for joining us. Good night.
Mm-hmm.